Hello, first graders. I'm back with some more chapters from our story, Old Mother Westwind. Chapter 3 is pretty short, so I'll probably read you chapter 3 and 4 back to back. Chapter 3 is called Why Grandfather Frog Has No Tail. Old Mother Westwind had gone to her day's work, leaving all the Merry Little Breezes to play in the green meadows. They had played tag and run races with the bees, and had played hide and seek with the sunbeams, and now they had gathered around the Smiling Pool, where on a green lily pad sat Grandfather Frog. Grandfather Frog was very old indeed, and very, very wise. He wore a green coat, and his voice was very deep. When Grandfather Frog spoke, everybody listened very respectfully. Even Billy Mink treated Grandfather Frog with respect, for Billy Mink's father and his father's father could not remember a time when Grandfather Frog had not sat upon the lily pad watching for green flies. Down in the Smiling Pool were some of Grandfather Frog's great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. You wouldn't have known that they were his grandchildren unless somebody told you. They didn't look the least bit like Grandfather Frog. They were round and fat, and they had long tails, and perhaps that's why they were called pollywogs. "Oh, Grandfather Frog, tell us why you don't have a tail like you did when you were young," begged one of the Merry Little Breezes. Grandfather Frog snapped up a foolish green fly and settled himself on his big lily pad, while all the Merry Little Breezes gathered around to listen. "Once upon a time," began Grandfather Frog, "the frogs ruled the world, which was mostly water at that time. There was very little dry land, oh, very little indeed. There were no boys to throw stones and no hungry mink to gobble up foolish frog babies who were taking a sunbath." Billy Mink, who had joined the Merry Little Breezes, was listening, and he squirmed uneasily, feeling a little guilty. "In those days, all the frogs had tails, long, handsome tails, of which they were very, very proud indeed," continued Grandfather Frog. "The king of all the frogs was twice as big as any other frog, and his tail was 3 times as long. He was very proud, oh, very proud indeed, of his long tail. He used to sit and admire it until he thought that there never had been and never could be such a tail. He used to wave it back and forth in the water, and every time he waved it back and forth, the other frogs would cry, 'Ooh, ah!' Every day the king grew more vain. He did nothing at all but eat and sleep and admire his own tail. Now all the other frogs did just as the king did, so pretty soon none of the frogs were doing anything but sitting about eating, sleeping, and admiring their own tails. Now you all know that people who do nothing worthwhile in this world are of no use, and there is little room for them. So when Mother Nature saw how useless had become the frog tribe, she called the King Frog before her, and she said, 'Because you can think of nothing but your own beauty and your own beautiful tail, that tail shall be taken away from you. Because you do nothing but eat and sleep, your mouth shall become wide like a door, and your eyes shall start forth from your head. You shall become bow-legged and ugly to look at, and all the world shall laugh at you.' The King Frog looked at his beautiful tail, and already it seemed to have grown shorter. He looked again, and it was shorter still. Every time he looked, his tail had grown shorter and smaller. By and by, when he looked, there was nothing left but a little stub, which he could not even wiggle. Then, even that disappeared. His eyes popped out of his head, and his mouth grew bigger and bigger." Old Grandfather Frog stopped and looked sadly at a foolish green fly coming his way. "Chug-a-rum," said Grandfather Frog, opening his mouth very wide and hopping up in the air. When he sat down again on his big lily pad, the green fly was nowhere to be seen. Then Grandfather Frog smacked his lips and continued, And from that day to this day, every frog has started life with a big tail. And as he has grown bigger and bigger, his tail has grown smaller and smaller until finally it disappears. And then he remembers how foolish and useless it is to be vain of what nature has given us. And that is how I came to lose my tail, finished Grandfather Frog. Thank you, shouted all the Merry Little Breezes. We won't forget. Then they ran a race to see who could reach Johnny Chuck's home first and tell him that Farmer Brown was coming down on the Green Meadows with a gun. So that was chapter 3. I'm sure you guys have seen tadpoles before, otherwise known as pollywogs. Okay, this is chapter 4, and it's called Why Jimmy Skunk Wears Stripes. So as you can tell, a lot of these stories are about why animals look like they do or have certain characteristics that they do. Jimmy Skunk, as everybody knows, wears a striped suit, a suit of black and white. There was a long, long, long time ago when all the skunk family wore black. Very handsome their coats were, too, a beautiful glossy black. They were very, very proud of them and took the greatest care of them, brushing them carefully ever so many times a day. There was a Jimmy Skunk then, just as there is now, and he was the head of all the skunk family. Now this Jimmy Skunk was very proud and thought himself very much of a gentleman. He was very independent and cared for no one. Like a great many other independent people, he did not always consider the rights of others. Indeed, it was hinted in the wood and on the Green Meadows that not all of Jimmy Skunk's doings would bear the light of day. It was openly said that he was altogether too fond of prowling about at night. But no one could prove that he was responsible for the mischief done in the night, for no one saw him. You see, his coat was so black that in the darkness of the night it was not visible at all. Now, about this time of which I am telling you, Mrs. Ruffled Grouse made a nest at the foot of the great pond, and in it she laid 15 beautiful buff eggs. Mrs. Grouse was very happy indeed, and all the little meadow folk who knew of her happiness were happy too, for they all loved the shy, demure little Mrs. Grouse. Every morning when Peter Rabbit trotted down the lone little path through the wood past the great pine, he would stop for a few minutes to chat with Mrs. Grouse. Happy Jack Squirrel would bring her the news every afternoon. The Merry Little Breezes of Old Mother West Wind would run up a dozen times a day to see how she was getting along. One morning, Peter Rabbit, coming down the lone little path for his usual morning call, found a terrible state of affairs. Poor little Mrs. Grouse was heartbroken. All about the foot of the great pine lay the empty shells of her beautiful eggs. They had been broken and scattered about this way and that. How did this happen? Asked Peter Rabbit. I don't know, sobbed poor Mrs. Grouse. In the night, when I was fast asleep, something pounced upon me. I managed to get up and fly up to the top of the great pine. In the morning, I found all my eggs broken, just as you see them here. And here's a picture. It's in black and white, so it's kind of hard to differentiate, but you can see the grouse there, kind of in the middle. And then the scattered eggs are all around. Peter Rabbit looked at the ground very carefully. He hunted around behind the great pine. He looked under the bushes. He studied the ground with a very wise air. Then he hopped off down the lone little path to the Green Meadows. He stopped at the house of Johnny Chuck. What makes your eyes so big and round? Asked Johnny Chuck. Peter Rabbit came very close so as to whisper in Johnny Chuck's ear, and he told all that he had seen. Together, they went to Jimmy Skunk's house. Jimmy Skunk was in bed. He was very sleepy and very cross when they came to the door. Peter Rabbit told him what he had seen. too bad, said Jimmy Skunk, and he yawned sleepily. Won't you join us in finding out who did it? Asked Johnny Chuck. Jimmy Skunk said he would be delighted to come, but that he had other business that morning and he would join them in the afternoon. Peter Rabbit and Jimmy Chuck went on. Pretty soon they met the Merry Little Breezes and told them the dreadful story. What shall we do? Asked Johnny Chuck. We'll hurry over and we'll tell old Dame Nature, cried the Merry Little Breezes, and we'll ask her what to do. So away flew the Merry Little Breezes to old Dame Nature, and they told her all about the dreadful story. Old Dame Nature listened very well. Then she sent the Merry Little Breezes to all the little meadow folks to tell everyone to be at the great pine that afternoon. Now, whatever old Dame Nature commanded, all the little meadow folks were obliged to do. They did not dare to disobey her. Promptly at 4 o'clock that afternoon, all the little meadow folks were gathered around at the foot of the great pine. Broken-hearted little Mrs. Ruffled Grouse sat behind her empty nest with all her broken shells beside her. Reddy Fox, Peter Rabbit, Johnny Chuck, Billy Mink, Little Joe Otter, Jerry Muskrat, Hooty the Owl, Baby Coon, Sammy Blue Jay, Blacky the Crow, Grandfather Frog, Mr. Toad, Spotty the Turtle, the Merry Little Breezes, all were there. Last of all came Jimmy Skunk. Very handsome he looked in his shiny black coat, and very sorry he appeared that such a dreadful thing should happen. He told Mrs. Grouse how badly he felt, and he loudly demanded that the culprit shall be found out and severely punished. Old Dame Nature has the most smiling face in the world, but this time her face was very, very grave indeed. First, she asked little Mrs. Grouse to tell the story all over again so that all might hear it. Then, each in turn was asked to tell where he had been the night before. Johnny Chuck, Happy Jack Squirrel, Striped Chipmunk, Sammy Jay, and Blacky the Crow all had gone to bed when Mr. Sun went down behind the Purple Hills. Jerry Muskrat, Billy Mink, Little Joe Otter, Grandfather Frog, and Spotty the Turtle had not left the swimming pool. Bobby Coon had been down in Farmer Brown's cornfield. Hooty the Owl had been hunting in the lower end of the Green Meadows. Peter Rabbit had been down in the berry patch. Mr. Toad had been under a big piece of bark, which he called a house. Old Dame Nature called on Jimmy Skunk last of all. Jimmy protested that he had been very, very tired and he had gone to bed very, very early indeed, and that he had slept the whole night through. Then old Dame Nature asked Peter Rabbit what he had found among the eggshells that morning. Peter Rabbit hopped out and laid 3 long black hairs before old Dame Nature. These, said Peter Rabbit, are what I found among the eggshells. Then old Dame Nature called Johnny Chuck. Tell us, Johnny Chuck, what you saw when you called at Jimmy Skunk's house this morning. I saw Jimmy Skunk, said Johnny Chuck, and Jimmy seemed very, very sleepy. It seemed to me that his whiskers were yellow. That will do, said old Dame Nature, and she called Old Mother West Wind. What time did you come down on the Green Meadows this morning? Asked old Dame Nature. Just at the break of day, said Old Mother West Wind, as Mr. Sun was coming up from behind the Purple Hills. And whom did you see so early in the morning? Asked old Dame Nature. I saw Bobby Coon going home from old Farmer Brown cornfield, said Old Mother West Wind. I saw Hooty the Owl coming back from the lower end of the Green Meadows. I saw Peter Rabbit down in the berry patch. Last of all, I saw something like a black shadow coming down the lone little path toward the house of Jimmy Skunk. Everyone was looking very hard at Jimmy Skunk. Jimmy Skunk began to look very uneasy and unhappy. Who wears a black coat? Asked Nature Dame. Jimmy Skunk, shouted all the little meadow folk. What might make whiskers turn yellow? Asked old Nature Dame. No one seemed to know at first. Then Peter Rabbit spoke up. It might be the yolk of an egg, said Peter Rabbit. Who are likely to be sleepy on a bright sunny morning? Asked Old Dame Nature. People who've been out all night, said Johnny Chuck, who always goes to bed with the sun. Jimmy Skunk, said Old Dame Nature, and her voice grew very stern indeed, and her face was very grave. Jimmy Skunk, I accuse you of having broken and eaten the eggs of Mrs. Grouse. What have you to say for yourself? Jimmy Skunk held his head low. He hadn't a word to say. He just wanted to sneak away and be by himself. Jimmy Skunk, said Old Dame Nature, because your handsome black coat, of which you are so proud, has made it possible for you to move about the night without being seen, and because we can no longer trust you upon your honor, henceforth you and all your descendants shall wear a striped coat, which is the sign that you cannot be trusted. Your coat hereafter shall be black and white, so that when you move about in the night, you will always be visible. And that is why, to this day, Jimmy Skunk wears a suit of striped black and white. And that's the end. So those are two good stories, chapters in our story. So you can tell them to your siblings or your parents and see if you can figure out what the message is. And both the stories is pretty similar. So I hope you guys are doing well, and I'll be back soon with more of our story, Old Mother West Wind. Bye, first grade. I miss you all.